They were not recruited the usual way. No posters, no announcements, no proud farewells at train stations. Instead, the questions came quietly. A man would be called into a small office, a room without flags, without ceremony. Someone would ask about languages he spoke, places he had lived, people he could disappear among. The questions felt ordinary until they weren't. Then came the pause. And finally, the sentence that changed everything. If you accept this, your name will not exist. There would be no uniform photographs, no unit patches, no official record tying them to the war. Even their families would not be told where they were going or if they were going anywhere at all. World War II demanded soldiers, but it also demanded ghosts. These men were selected because they could blend into shadows, because they could survive without recognition, because they could carry orders that would never be written down. They signed papers they were never allowed to keep. Some didn't sign anything at all. Their consent existed only in memory, and once they stepped into that role, they vanished. On paper, they were never assigned. In records, they were never deployed. In history, they were never there. Yet they fought across Europe, across the Pacific, in places that would later be described only as classified locations. They moved without insignia. Their uniforms were plain. Their instructions were verbal. If captured, no one would claim them. They were told this clearly. If something happens to you, there will be no record, no rescue, no acknowledgement. Silence was not a risk. It was the rule. Families back home noticed the absence before they understood it. A son who had enlisted simply stopped writing. A husband whose letters suddenly ended without explanation. No telegram, no notice of death, no confirmation of life, just nothing. Some families assumed reassignment. Others assumed the worst, but had no proof. The war was chaotic, they told themselves. Mail was slow. Information was delayed. They did not know their loved ones had been erased on purpose. These units operated between the lines of history. They trained at night. They traveled under false designations. Their missions were passed from mouth to mouth, never to paper. Even other soldiers did not know who they were. They sabotaged supply lines, gathered intelligence, moved through enemy territory dressed as civilians. Sometimes they did not even know the full objective, only what they needed to do next. And when they succeeded, the victory belonged to no one. No headlines, no medals, no photographs. When they failed, the cost was even heavier. A man could die in the field, and officially, nothing had happened. His body might be buried under another name, more not recovered at all. His family would wait for news that would never come. In government offices, files were marked and locked away. Some were destroyed entirely. Others were sealed for decades. The reasoning was always the same: national security. But security has a human price. One soldier, his name never recorded, publicly kept a journal hidden in his boot. He wrote not about missions, but about being invisible, about how strange it felt to fight for a country that could not acknowledge him. "If I die," he wrote, "it will be as if I never lived these years." Many of them felt the same quiet fear, not of death, but of erasure. They watched parades in liberated towns from the edges of crowds. They heard speeches about heroism, knowing their work would never be mentioned. They learned to swallow pride, because pride required witnesses. The war moved on. Battles ended. Borders shifted. And slowly, these units were dissolved the same way they had been created, without ceremony. Some men were reassigned and told never to speak of what they had done. Others were discharged quietly. No explanation given to employers. No stories allowed at family dinners. They returned home changed, carrying memories they were forbidden to share. Try explaining nightmares without a past. Try asking for recognition when officially you were never there. Some applied for benefits and were denied because their service could not be verified. Others never applied at all, knowing the answer already. Years passed, history books were written, museums were built, names were engraved in stone, and still these men were missing, not because they did not serve, but because someone decided the world should never know they did. Their stories remained scattered, hidden in declassified fragments, whispered in families, hinted at in documents that raised more questions than answers. They were soldiers without chapters, veterans without proof, heroes without history. And as time erased witnesses, the silence grew stronger. Because when a unit officially never existed, its truth becomes the easiest thing to forget. Once they crossed the line, there was no going back. No radio call signs that could be traced. No dog tags. No paperwork that tied them to anything official. They were given new names, temporary ones, and told not to grow attached. Names were for people who expected to be remembered. Their missions came quietly. A man would lean close, speak low, and then walk away. No maps were handed over. Locations were memorized, then burned. If questioned later, they were expected to remember nothing that could be proven. They moved through territory that did not exist on maps the public would ever see. Roads erased from atlases, towns referred to only by code. Even the weather reports were classified. Capture was the unspoken nightmare. If they were taken alive, there would be no prisoner exchange, no acknowledgement, no Red Cross notification. They would be civilians in enemy hands, or worse, traitors with no country to claim them. They knew this, and still they went. Some missions were small, cutting communication lines, planting misinformation, observing troop movements. Others were larger, more dangerous, guiding airstrikes without being credited, removing targets that officially were never targeted. They learned to live between moments, always alert, always listening. At night, they slept lightly, boots on, weapons close, knowing that if they disappeared, the world would keep moving. They witnessed things no one would ever officially confirm. Villages emptied overnight, men executed without trial, orders carried out that would later be denied. And when the mission ended, they did not return to bases with flags or music. They returned to anonymity. Sometimes, they were ordered to leave no survivors, not because of cruelty, but because witnesses created records. Records created questions, and questions threatened silence. The weight of that knowledge followed them long after the fighting stopped. One man later described the strangest part of the war. We did things that mattered deeply, and yet we were told they never happened. Communication with home was rare and censored beyond recognition. Letters, when allowed, were stripped of meaning. Locations removed, timelines erased, entire paragraphs blacked out. Some stopped writing altogether. What was the point when the truth could not be told? Families sensed something was wrong, but could not name it. A letter that sounded unlike their son. A tone that felt distant, guarded. Words chosen carefully, as if someone else were listening. Because someone always was. The men learned to disappear emotionally as well. You cannot survive invisibility without becoming invisible inside. Friendships within the unit were brief and cautious. Names were not shared. Past lives were not discussed. The future was never mentioned because futures required acknowledgement. Losses happened quietly. A man would be there one night and gone the next. No ceremony, no words spoken. His absence would be noted, and the mission would continue. Grief had no place to rest. Even among themselves, they did not mourn openly. To do so was to admit attachment. Attachment was dangerous. When the war began to turn and victory became a possibility, they felt no relief, only uncertainty. What happens to a soldier when the war ends and he does not exist? Some were ordered to stay in place long after fighting stopped, cleaning traces, closing loose ends. Others were dismissed with a sentence so simple it felt unreal. You're done. Go home. No debrief, no thanks, no record. They returned to cities celebrating victory, watching strangers cheer for a war they had fought in silence. They stood in crowds, unnoticed, while medals were pinned on others. Some felt pride anyway, others felt only emptiness. At night, the war returned in fragments, faces without names, places without locations, actions without acknowledgement. They learned quickly that silence was not temporary. They were warned explicitly that speaking would have consequences, not just for them, but for people they loved. The past was sealed. The future depended on forgetting. And so they tried. They built lives on top of missing years, took jobs that asked questions they could not answer, avoided conversations about the war, smiled when others shared stories, clapped when names were honored. Inside, something remained unresolved because history had moved on without them. And when history forgets you, you begin to wonder whether you were ever real at all. They came home to a country that did not know them. Parades filled the streets. Bands played. Flags waved from windows. Names were printed in newspapers. Stories told and retold until they became legend. There was nothing to return to, at least. Nothing that could acknowledge what they had been. They took off uniforms that had never officially existed. They packed away weapons they were never supposed to carry. And they stepped back into civilian life carrying memories they were forbidden to explain. When asked where they had been during the war, they learned to give vague answers. Overseas, support work, logistics, answers that ended conversations instead of opening them. Some tried to forget. They married, found work, built families. But silence does not disappear when you need it to. It follows you into ordinary moments, sent to grocery stores, into quiet evenings, into dreams that replay events no one else believes happened. Others struggled more visibly. Nightmares, anger without a clear source, guilt that had no name. They were veterans without proof, suffering without recognition. When benefits became available, many did not apply. How do you prove service that officially never occurred? Those who tried were often turned away. No records, no unit numbers, no verification. The system that had used them now required paperwork they could not provide. Families felt the absence, even if they did not understand it. Children sensed that parts of their fathers' lives were locked away. Questions were answered, gently or not at all. The silence became generational. Years turned into decades. Files were moved from offices to archives. Some were destroyed. Others were sealed, marked to be opened long after those involved were gone. History textbooks simplified the war. Timelines were cleaned. Complexity was smoothed into clarity. And the ghost units remained ghosts. Occasionally, fragments surfaced. A declassified memo with missing names. A photograph with faces blurred. A mission described without attribution. Researchers noticed inconsistencies. Operations that required manpower, yet listed no participants. Successes with no units credited. The gaps were too large to ignore. Slowly, quietly, the truth began to surface. Not in announcements, not in apologies, but in whispers. Some veterans, now old, began to speak carefully, partially, enough to confirm what many had suspected but could never prove. They told stories that sounded impossible. Fighting without identification, missions without records, losses without acknowledgement. Some were believed, others were dismissed as confused by time. Memory is fragile, especially when history offers nothing to support it. A few received late recognition, medals awarded in private, letters acknowledging service without detail, gestures meant to close a chapter that had been left open too long. But many did not live to see even that. They died as they had lived during the war, recorded families, found out after funerals, after estate papers, after old boxes were opened, a hidden document, a coded notebook, a quiet confession written late in life. Suddenly, years of silence made sense. The man they had known had lived another life, one that history had chosen to forget. For some, the revelation brought pride. For others, anger. And for many, sadness. Because recognition delayed is not the same as recognition denied, but it still hurts. Today, the legacy of these units remains incomplete. Names are still missing. Stories are still fragmented. The full truth may never be known. But the silence is no longer total. We know now that World War II was not only fought by the men we remember, it was also fought by those who were erased, by soldiers who accepted invisibility as the price of service, who gave years of their lives knowing there would be no proof they were ever there. They did not fight for glory. They did not fight for recognition. They fought because they were asked. And when the war ended, history moved on without them. But absence leaves a shape, and in the empty spaces of the record, their presence still lingers, unwritten, uncredited, unforgotten, if we choose to remember. Because history is not only the story of what was recorded, it is also the story of what was deliberately left out.